It was 10 years ago today that North America was hit with its biggest ever blackout.
Yeah, power outage that began in Ohio spread to 8 states and most of Ontario, leaving more than 50 million people without power, some as long as 4 days. Experts say the blackout tested Ontario's aging electrical system and helped to bring in mandatory reliability standards. But while Hydro said that the possibility of a similar event occurring today is low, the grid is still vulnerable to cyber threats, human error, and extreme weather.
Glen McGillivray is the managing director of the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction, and he's an expert in disaster planning, and he's joining us from our Queen's Park studio. Glen, if the events of a decade ago prove anything, it's that our power grid then was much more fragile than anybody realized. Are you more confident 10 years later that the system is, in fact, greatly improved?
Well, we've had big blackouts in the 60s, the 70s, probably every decade going back 40 or 50 years. And after each one, we learn some lessons and we make some improvements. But it seems that when the next one comes, we find out that there's new holes and new gaps, and there are all some new learnings that have to be made. So I think some changes have been made and things are improved to some extent. But I don't think we're all the way there yet.
Clearly not. I mean, the last big rainstorm, we had all those substations being drowned out because all the water would pool in them. I mean, clearly you would think that would have been thought of ahead of time. You don't put a substation somewhere where water is going to leak into it.
Well, you know, that's not for me to say how we should design these systems exactly, but certainly it's a good point. With the weather that we've been getting recently and what we're going to get in the future, we really have to think of these things.
What businesses would you say are most vulnerable to blackouts? I heard someone calling into a radio show today saying he had taken his wife to hospital right before the blackout, and literally she came out of the operating room 10 minutes before the power went out, and they said, listen, you know, you're lucky. It might not have worked out so well. Are hospitals, most affected in a negative way?
Well, I think hospitals should be probably one of the better places to be if there's a blackout. Certainly, though, we learned through Hurricane Sandy, for example, that a couple of hospitals in New York City weren't ready for these things. A lot of their emergency equipment was in the lower levels of the hospitals, subject to flooding and rain and that sort of thing. I don't know if there's a pecking order of, where we're the safest and where things are the worst, but we see things like, food establishments, grocery stores get hit pretty hard during blackouts. Restaurant establishments, a lot of retail and things of that nature. But individuals as well. Individual homes get hit as well.
Well, let's look at our power system. I think now probably one of the greatest threats to it is cyber attack. Is that really something that we need to worry about?
Well, I mean, I'm not an expert in cyber attack. A lot of the work that we do is in the severe weather area. Mm-hmm. But certainly when we talk about perhaps smart grids and linking the grid into the web, into the wireless web, these are things we have to think about.
It's all interconnected, isn't it?
Absolutely.
It was only a couple of weeks ago that some families in southern Ontario experienced a power outage for several days. Does it make sense? Is it smart to have your own, I guess, a small generator on your property so that you, in case your elderly can't deal with the heat, or if it's in the winter, that you're prepared to take care of at least yourself and your family?
Well, let me answer it this way. I don't have a generator at home, but I'm seriously thinking about it. I think the prices have come down quite a bit over the last few years.
How much do they cost?
A lot of options.
Do you know what they cost?
Well, I think you can get a generator in around the $1,000 range and on up, depending on what you need and what your wants are. And you can look at propane, natural gas, diesel, if you wish. But I think they're a smart investment. We see just how reliant we are on electrical power, our heating systems, our cooling systems, our computers, of course. And then if you have a sump pump at your home, power outage and rainstorm often go hand in hand, as we saw in Toronto a few weeks ago. So I've heard stories of people bailing out their sump pit by hand for 36 straight hours to try to save their basements. So I think it's very important consideration.
I think you've inadvertently hit the nail on the head with that answer, Glen, because it's $1,000, let's say, for a generator. That's the bottom line. People don't want to spend, corporations don't want to spend, government doesn't want to spend, no one wants to spend the extra buck to be prepared. And that's the mindset that I suppose you have to deal with.
And it's a huge barrier that we have to overcome. Government tends to think in the short term. Individuals tend to kind of point at government as their savior and think, well, I should just be able to call 911 and get help. They may not realize that they may be, in a tough spot for 2-3 days or more. People, we find, just aren't willing to kind of take the bull by the horns and take actions themselves to protect themselves, their families, their properties. They tend to pass blame on others, like governments.
And on the plus side, communities sometimes do come together and friendships are formed. Thanks so much for your time today. That's Glen McGillivray. He's the Managing Director of the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction and an expert in disaster planning. Hopefully we won't need you for a while.
Thanks, Glenn.